The coal stove hissed in the corner of Mundy's general store, but the heat didn't reach the frost patterns crawling across the windows. Clara Henshaw's breath came out in pale clouds as she pushed through the door, the bell above jangling sharp in the December morning silence. Eli's hand was small and cold in hers. His cough had woken her 4 times in the night. The store smelled of kerosene and flour dust, and the tobacco Silas Mundy kept in a tin behind the counter. Saturday morning meant the place was packed, ranch wives buying staples, their husbands negotiating credit terms in low voices. Clara kept her chin up as she approached the counter, though her worn wool coat hung loose where she'd lost weight these past months. "Mr. Mundy?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with you about my account." Mundy's eyes flicked to her, then to the boy coughing into his sleeve. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out the ledger, the public ledger, the one everyone could see. He opened it flat on the counter, turned it so the room could read the numbers. His finger traced down to her name. $47, Mrs. Henshaw. His voice carried to every corner of the store. "That's 3 months of flour and staples you owe." Heat crawled up Clara's neck. The room had gone quiet. She felt eyes on her back. Ida Kern from the boarding house, the Patterson brothers, old Mr. Howell, Honor Howell. She clutched the flour sack in her arms, the one with her name embroidered along the hem in Thomas's careful stitching. "I can pay." She set the sack down and reached for the thick braid coiled at her neck. Her hair had always been her vanity, auburn, waist-length, the one thing Thomas had loved to touch. "I'm told wig makers pay for hair." Mundy's mouth twitched. "Ain't worth $5, ma'am. You owe 47. The store stayed silent. Eli coughed again, a wet sound that made Clara's chest tighten. "Then what do you propose, Mr. Mundy?" He leaned back, studying her the way a man studies livestock. "Scrub my floors daily for a month, 5 a.m., before opening." In the corner near the back shelves, a man Clara didn't recognize straightened from where he'd been examining rope coils. Tall, worn duster, hat brim low, his jaw went tight. Clara's hands shook as she picked up the flour sack. She nodded once. 5 a.m., starting tomorrow." The stranger's hand moved toward his coat pocket, then stopped. The walk back to her shack took an hour in the cold. Eli's cough rattled worse with every step, and by the time Clara pushed through the door, his lips had gone pale. She wrapped him in both their blankets and built up the fire with the last of the kindling Thomas had split before the accident. "Mama," Eli's voice was small. "My chest hurts." Clara pressed her hand to his forehead. Hot. Too hot. She ladled water from the bucket and made him drink, then pulled the rag from her apron pocket. When he coughed into it, she turned away so he wouldn't see the red flecks. Ida Kern had warned her 2 days ago, standing on the porch with a basket of day-old bread. "If that cough breaks his ribs, there's nothing I can do." The boarding house keeper had lost her own son to pneumonia 5 winters back. She knew the sound of death rattling in small lungs. Clara sat by the fire and tried to remember how to pray. Thomas's chair stood empty across from her. She hadn't moved it. Couldn't. Some mornings she still set out 2 cups for coffee before remembering. The wind picked up outside, howling through the gaps in the walls. She'd need to stuff them with rags before true winter hit, need to split more wood, need to find a way to pay Mundy that didn't involve destroying her hands with lye soap every morning in the dark. But Eli needed medicine, and medicine cost money she didn't have. She pulled Thomas's flour sack into her lap, traced the embroidered letters with her thumb. He'd done the stitching by lamplight their first winter together, his big hands clumsy with the needle. "So you remember you're mine," he'd said, grinning, "even when I'm not here." He'd meant when he was logging in the mountains, not when he was dead. Clara folded the sack and set it on the shelf beside the stove. Tomorrow she'd scrub Mundy's floors, and the day after, and the day after that. 30 days on her knees in the dark, breathing lye fumes while the whole town walked past and pretended not to see. She'd done harder things. She'd buried her husband. She'd survived this. Garrett Thorne bought his winter supplies in silence. Flour, salt pork, coffee beans, rope for the cattle pens he'd need to mend before the January drive. He paid in coin and kept his hat low, listening. Mundy rang up the purchases with quick efficiency, his fingers stained with ledger ink. The man moved like someone who'd been keeping books for years, precise, methodical, always watching who came through the door. "That'll be $8 even, Mr. Thorne." Garrett counted out the coins. Behind him, a woman with a baby on her hip asked about credit for lamp oil. Mundy's voice shifted, went harder. Your husband's account is 60 days past due, Mrs. Calloway. No more credit until that's settled. The woman's face flushed. She left without the oil. Garrett gathered his supplies and moved toward the door, but Mundy's voice stopped him. Staying through winter, are you? Cattle contracts don't negotiate themselves. Mundy nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. Prices are what they are out here, Mr. Thorne. Territorial inspectors don't come till spring mud clears. Man's got to charge for the risk. Something in the way he said it, too casual, too practiced, made Garrett's jaw tighten. You got a territorial pricing list? For comparison. Mundy's smile didn't reach his eyes. Lost it in a fire 2 winters back. Shame, really. Outside, the December wind cut through Garrett's duster as he loaded supplies into his wagon. The stable boy, Tim, the kid had said his name was, came around the corner leading a bay mare. Mr. Thorne. The boy's voice was quiet. That widow, the one with the sick boy. She's good people. Gave me soup once when I was hungry. Garrett looked at him. Tim couldn't be more than 12, all elbows and worn-through boots. Mundy ain't good people, Tim added, just so you know. The boy led the mare away before Garrett could respond. Garrett climbed onto the wagon and flicked the reins. 5 miles to his winter camp, where he'd spend the next months buying cattle from ranchers desperate to cull their herds before the deep freeze. Lonely work, cold work, but it paid. And it kept him moving, and moving meant he didn't have to think about the cabin in Colorado he'd left empty 5 years ago. He told himself he was done helping people. Done getting involved. Done watching women with sick children try to hold their lives together with nothing but pride and stubbornness. But that widow's face, when Mundy read her debt aloud, the way she'd offered her hair like it was nothing, the way her hands shook when she picked up that flour sack. Garrett urged the horses faster. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the temperature with it. Behind him, smoke rose from the town. Somewhere in those cold shacks, a boy was coughing himself raw, while his mother counted the days until her knees gave out on Mundy's floor. Not his problem. Couldn't be his problem. The wagon hit a rut, and Garrett's hand went to his coat pocket, where the coins for the widow's medicine sat heavy as stones. 5 o'clock came dark and cold. Clara woke before the knock on her door, dressed in the dim light of a single candle, and walked the 2 miles to town with her hands wrapped in rags. The lye soap waited for her in a bucket beside Mundy's back door, along with a scrub brush worn down to nubs. The store was locked, but Mundy had left the key under a stone. Clara let herself in and knelt on the plank floor in the darkness. The coal stove was dead, the room colder than the air outside. She lit the lamp Mundy had left on the counter, poured lye soap into the bucket, and added water from the pump out back. The first touch of the brush against the floor sent pain shooting through her knuckles. By the time she'd scrubbed her way from the door to the counter, her hands were raw. She worked in silence, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the building settling. The smell of lye burned her throat. Her knees ached against the wood, but she kept her back straight and her movements steady the way Thomas had taught her to split kindling. Rhythm over force, endurance over speed. At 6:30, the door opened. Clara didn't look up, probably Mundy come to inspect her work. But the boots that crossed the floor were different. Worn leather, spurs that jangled soft. The man stopped beside her, and Clara caught the scent of coffee and cold air. "Ma'am," she looked up, "the stranger from yesterday." Up close, she could see his face, weathered, maybe 40, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He held out a clean handkerchief. "For your hands." Clara sat back on her heels. Her knuckles were bleeding where the skin had cracked. She shook her head. "I don't take charity, mister." "Didn't offer charity. Offered a handkerchief." He set it on the counter and moved toward the back shelves, his boots echoing in the empty store. Clara stared at the square of white cloth for a long moment. Then she picked it up and wrapped it around her right hand. The fabric was soft, well worn. It smelled like wood smoke. She went back to scrubbing. Garrett found Reverend Amos Whitfield in the small room behind the church, writing tomorrow's sermon by lamplight. The preacher looked up when Garrett knocked, his wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down his nose. "Mr. Thorne, didn't expect to see you this early. Need to ask you something." Garrett stepped inside and shut the door. The room smelled of old paper and candle wax. "That widow, Clara Henshaw. How long's Mundy had her trapped?" Amos set down his pen. "Since her husband died. 8 months now." "She the only one?" The Reverend's face went still. He stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the snow-covered cemetery. "4 others, all widows, all with children. Mundy inflates the prices, extends credit, then collects through labor when they can't pay. Legal as Sunday." Legal and moral ain't the same thing. No. Amos turned back to him. They're not. But Mundy's got the only store for 30 miles, and the territorial inspectors don't come till spring. Who's going to stop him? Garrett's jaw tightened. Someone should. You planning to be someone, Mr. Thorne? I'm planning to get some answers. Garrett moved toward the door, then stopped. He mentioned anything about a territorial pricing list? Claims he lost it in a fire. 2 winters back, he says. Same fire that supposedly destroyed some complaint letters the Patterson widow tried to send to Helena. Amos's voice went quiet. Funny how that fire only burned what Mundy needed burned. Garrett's hand went to the door handle. How far's Helena? 3 days' ride, each way. The Reverend crossed his arms. In blizzard season, you'll freeze. Maybe. Garrett pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in. Or maybe I'll get some proof that fire didn't burn everything. The snow started that night, big, wet flakes that stuck to everything and turned the roads to mud ice. Garrett packed supplies by lamplight in his winter camp, his breath clouding in the cold canvas shelter. The cattle shifted in their pens, restless. He hadn't planned to stay in this town longer than necessary. Buy cattle, negotiate contracts, move on. That was the pattern he'd followed for 5 years, ever since Sarah died, trying to birth their daughter, ever since he'd buried them both in Colorado soil and started riding. But that widow's hands, bleeding into his handkerchief, the boy's cough, Mundy's smile when he'd mentioned the fire, some things a man couldn't ride away from. Garrett saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness and turned toward Helena. The wind cut through his duster and the snow came down harder, but he kept the mare moving. 3 days there, 3 days back. And somewhere in the territorial offices, a pricing list that would prove what everyone in town already knew, but couldn't say out loud. Mundy was a thief, legal, careful, protected by distance and winter and the desperation of people with nowhere else to go. But thieves made mistakes, and fires didn't burn everything, no matter what Mundy claimed. Garrett urged the mare into a trot. Behind him, the town disappeared into the storm. Somewhere in those cold buildings, Clara Henshaw was on her knees, scrubbing floors in the dark while her son coughed himself raw. He'd told himself he was done saving people. But maybe some people didn't need saving. Maybe they just needed someone to hand them the weapon they couldn't reach themselves. The territorial pricing list was a weapon. Garrett meant to bring it back. 3 days there, 3 days back. And then Mundy would learn that winter didn't protect everyone. Only some storms came from the sky. Others came on horseback carrying proof that couldn't be burned. The blizzard hit on the second day. Garrett pushed through it, head down, following the road by memory and instinct. The wind screamed across the open prairie, and the snow came sideways, stinging his face like thrown sand. The mare stumbled twice, but he kept her moving. Stop in weather like this, and you didn't start again. Helena appeared through the white curtain on the third afternoon, buildings like dark shapes against the storm, smoke rising from chimneys. Garrett found the territorial office on the main street and tied his horse under the awning. His hands were so cold he could barely work the knot. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk piled with papers, a coal stove glowing in the corner. The man looked up when Garrett stamped the snow off his boots. "Help you?" "Need a territorial pricing circular, standard rates for general goods." The clerk blinked. "You rode through that storm for a pricing list?" "I did." The man shrugged and disappeared into a back room. He returned 5 minutes later with a folded document, official seal pressed into the bottom corner. "This what you need?" Garrett unfolded it. Flour, $2.20 per 50-pound sack. Medicine powder, 80 cents per tin. Salt pork, $1.40 per pound. He read through the whole list twice, committing the numbers to memory. "Can I keep this?" "It's public record. Take it." Garrett folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his coat, against his chest where his body heat would keep it dry. "Much obliged." The ride back took 4 days. The storm broke on the second, leaving the world white and silent, the roads buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Garrett's supplies ran low. He shot a rabbit on the third day and ate it half-cooked over a fire that wouldn't stay lit, but the paper stayed dry against his chest, and that was all that mattered. He rode into town on a gray January afternoon, his beard crusted with ice, his fingers numb inside his gloves. Tim was in the stable when Garrett led the mare inside. The boy's eyes went wide. "Thought you'd frozen." "Almost did." Garrett stripped the saddle off and rubbed the mare down with handfuls of straw. His hands shook from exhaustion. "How's the widow?" Tim's face went careful. "Still scrubbing, every morning. Her hands look real bad, Mr. Thorne." Garrett nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out the territorial pricing circular. The paper crackled, stiff from the cold. You know what this is? No, sir. Proof. Garrett tucked it back inside his coat. You tell anyone you saw me with this, Tim? The boy shook his head hard. No, sir. I ain't stupid. Didn't think you were. Garrett pressed a coin into Tim's palm. Keep it that way. Clara finished her 21st morning of scrubbing on a Thursday. Her hands had stopped bleeding after the first week, but the skin had gone thick and cracked, her knuckles swollen. She could barely hold a spoon to feed Eli his breakfast. But the medicine Reverend Amos had brought 3 weeks ago, anonymous donation he'd said, wouldn't tell her who, had eased Eli's cough. The boy could sleep through the night now without waking her with his gasping. That was worth ruined hands, worth 30 mornings in the dark with lye soap burning her throat. She was rinsing the bucket out back when she heard boots on the boards. Not Mundy's quick, precise steps, someone heavier. She turned. The stranger stood in the doorway, snow melting off his shoulders. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face rough with beard, but his eyes were the same, storm cloud gray, watchful. Ma'am, he pulled off his hat. Need to speak with you. Clara set down the bucket. I'm working. I know. He glanced toward the front of the store, then back to her. How much longer you owe Mundy? 9 days. Her voice came out flat. Then my debt's paid. It's not. She stiffened. Excuse me? Your debt. It's not paid, won't ever be paid, the way Mundy runs his books. The stranger stepped closer, his voice dropping. He's been overcharging you 40%. Overcharging everyone. I got proof. Clara's hands tightened on the bucket handle. What kind of proof? He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The territorial seal caught the lamplight. Official pricing list. From Helena. Shows what he should be charging versus what he is charging. She took the paper with shaking hands and unfolded it. The numbers swam in front of her eyes. Flour, $2.20. Mundy had charged her $3.10. Medicine, 80 cents. Mundy had charged $1.20. Down the list. Every item, 40% more than the territorial standard. Her throat went tight. He's been robbing us. He has. Clara looked up at the stranger. Who are you? Garrett Thorne, cattle buyer, winter hauler, man who doesn't like seeing widows taken advantage of. He took the paper back and tucked it carefully into his coat. I'm going to show this to Mundy. Thought you should know first. He'll deny it. Say the list is old or wrong, or let him deny it. Let the whole town hear him try. Garrett's jaw set. Sometimes exposure's enough. Sometimes shame's enough. Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd lived through 8 months of Mundy's system, 8 months of watching other women trapped the same way, and she knew how men like him worked. They didn't feel shame. They felt entitled. Still, this stranger had ridden through a blizzard to get proof, had come back, had told her first, before taking it to Mundy, like her opinion mattered. When? She asked. Tomorrow, Saturday, when the store's full. Garrett put his hat back on. You don't have to be there, but if you want to be, I won't stop you. He walked away before she could answer, his boots echoing on the boards. Clara stood in the cold room, her ruined hands aching, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, small and fragile, but there. Saturday morning came cold and clear. Clara finished her scrubbing by 6:30 and went home to change Eli's bandages. The boy's cough had faded to an occasional wheeze, but his ribs still showed through his shirt when she helped him dress. She fed him the last of the oatmeal and tried not to think about what came after her 30 days were up. 9 more mornings. Then what? Mundy would still own the ledger, would still control the credit, would still have his hand on the throat of every widow and struggling family in 30 miles. Unless Garrett Thorne's paper changed something. Clara braided her hair and pinned it up, then walked back to town. The store would be packed by 9. Saturday was when the ranchers came in, when debts got settled and new credit extended. When Mundy's ledger came out and everyone pretended not to see whose names got read aloud. She arrived at 8:45. The store was already filling, Mrs. Patterson, with her 3 daughters, the Calloway family, Old Howell, and his son, half a dozen ranch hands buying tobacco and ammunition. Ida Kern stood near the fabric bolts, pretending to examine calico. Mundy was behind the counter, his ledger open, his fingers stained with ink. He looked up when Clara entered and nodded once. Professional, courteous. The way a man nods at livestock he owns. Garrett Thorne came through the door at 9 exactly. He'd shaved. His duster was brushed clean of trail dust, and his hat sat square on his head. He carried himself different, not casual, not friendly, purposeful. He walked straight to the counter and pulled the territorial pricing circular from his coat. The paper crackled as he unfolded it and laid it flat beside Mundy's ledger. "Got a question for you, Mundy." The store went quiet. Conversation stopped mid-word. Even the children seemed to sense something happening. Mundy looked at the paper, then at Garrett. "What's this?" "Territorial pricing list. Standard rates. Official." Garrett's voice carried to every corner. "Says here flour should run $2.20 per 50-pound sack. You've been charging $3.10. Mundy's smile didn't waver. "Freight costs, winter premiums. Man's got to charge for the risk. Says here medicine powder runs 80 cents per tin. You've been charging $1.20. Garrett tapped the paper. "That's 40% over standard. Every item, every customer." The murmurs started then. Low voices, people checking their own receipts, doing arithmetic in their heads. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. Old Howell's jaw tightened. Mundy reached for the paper. "Let me see that." Garrett held it out of reach. "You can see it fine from there. That list's outdated. Territorial office don't account for, it's dated November. 2 months old." Garrett's voice went hard. "You've been telling folks you lost your pricing list in a fire 2 winters back. Convenient fire. Burned exactly what you needed burned." Mundy's smile finally cracked. His hand moved fast. He snatched the paper from Garrett's grip and turned toward the coal stove. "My store. My rules." He fed the paper to the flames, the territorial seal curled black, the numbers disappearing into ash. The store filled with the smell of burning ink. Garrett didn't move, didn't shout, just watched the paper burn with his arms crossed. "There," Mundy said, brushing his hands on his apron. "Problem solved." "Not quite." Garrett's voice was cold. "See, I memorized those numbers. And I'm a cattle buyer. I negotiate contracts for a living. I know exactly how much freight should add, and it ain't 40%. He turned to face the room. "Any of you want to know what you should have been paying versus what Mundy charged? I'll tell you. Right now, in front of eyewitnesses." The murmurs got louder. Clara watched Mundy's face go tight, watched his fingers curl into fists. This was the moment. Either the town would stand with Garrett, or they'd back down the way they always did, too afraid of losing their only source of supplies, too desperate to risk Mundy's anger. Old Howell stepped forward first. "I'd like to hear those numbers, Mr. Thorne. Then Mrs. Patterson, then the Calloways. One by one, they moved closer to the counter. Mundy's eyes swept the room. He was losing control. Clara could see it in the way his shoulders went rigid, in the way his hand moved toward the ledger like a man reaching for a weapon. "You want to know the numbers?" Mundy's voice rose. "Fine. But let's talk about what it costs to run the only store in 30 miles. Let's talk about what it costs to extend credit to people who can't pay. Let's talk about risk. Let's talk about Mrs. Henshaw." Garrett pointed at Clara. "She owes you $47. By territorial rates, she should owe $32. You've been charging her $15 she don't actually owe. For what? For the privilege of feeding her son?" Every eye in the store turned to Clara. She felt the weight of their stares, felt her face go hot, but she kept her chin up and her hands steady, even though they ached. "That's a lie," Mundy said. "Then show us your cost sheets. Show us your freight invoices. Prove the markup's legitimate." Mundy's jaw worked. He looked at the faces around him, neighbors, customers, people he'd been squeezing for years. "I don't have to prove anything. This is my store. You don't like my prices, you can ride to Helena and shop there." "Maybe we will," Old Howell said quietly. The words hung in the air. Mundy's face went white, then red. "Get out." His finger pointed at Garrett. "You're not welcome here. Not in my store." Garrett didn't move. "You sure about that? I'm supposed to negotiate cattle contracts for half the ranches in this valley. Where you think they're going to sign those contracts if I'm not welcome in the only place with a table big enough?" Mundy's mouth opened, then closed. The mathematics of his position were shifting. He needed the cattle buyers, needed their business, needed the ranchers to keep coming through his door, but he couldn't let this stand, couldn't let some outsider expose him in front of the whole town. His hand shot out and grabbed Clara's account page from the ledger. He tore it free and held it over the stove. Mrs. Henshaw's debt just went to $60, for the interest on her attitude. He dropped the page into the flames before anyone could stop him. Clara's vision went gray at the edges. $60. She'd never pay it. Never. She'd be scrubbing his floors until Eli was grown. Garrett's hand went to his gun belt, not to the pistol, but to the leather pouch beside it. But before he could open it, the door behind them swung wide. Reverend Amos Whitfield stepped inside, snow on his shoulders, his Bible under his arm. "Silas." The Reverend's voice cut through the chaos. "I think we need to talk about what's been happening in this town." Mundy's face went very still. "This ain't church business, Amos. When widows are being robbed, it's God's business and mine." The Reverend moved to the counter. His eyes swept the room. "Seems like truth's trying to come to light. Question is whether we're going to let it." The store stayed silent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. $60. The number kept repeating in her head. Then Garrett spoke, quiet and steady. "Reverend's right. Truth's trying to come to light. Only question is whether Mundy's going to keep burning it." The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring. Mundy stood behind his counter like a man defending a fort, his ledger clutched against his chest. Clara slipped out before anyone could ask her questions she didn't have answers for. She walked home in the gray afternoon light, her mind spinning. $60, the number was impossible. Even if she scrubbed floors for a year, she'd never clear it. Mundy had made sure of that. Eli was asleep when she arrived, his breathing steady for the first time in weeks. Clara sat beside his cot and let the tears come. Silent, hot, the kind that burned behind your eyes and made your throat close. She'd thought Garrett Thorne's paper would change something, thought exposure would matter, but men like Mundy didn't care about exposure. They cared about control, and he still had all of it. The knock came an hour later. Clara wiped her face and opened the door to find Reverend Amos on her porch, his coat damp with melting snow. "Mrs. Henshaw." He removed his hat. May I come in?" She stepped aside. The Reverend moved to the fire and warmed his hands, his face troubled in the flickering light. "What Mundy did today was evil," he said quietly. "Plain evil. No other word for it." Clara's voice came out raw. "Evil or not, I still owe him $60. "You don't owe him anything. Not morally. Not in the eyes of God." Amos turned to face her. "But legally, you're right. He's got you trapped." "Then why are you here?" The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. "Because sometimes the law needs a pulpit, and sometimes God's people need to see the truth laid out plain, where they can't ignore it." Clara shook her head. "They saw the truth today. Didn't matter. Mundy burned it." "He burned the paper, not the proof." Amos pulled something from his coat, a small notebook, pages covered in careful handwriting. "I've been keeping records, every widow in this town, every debt, every price Mundy charged versus what the territorial standard should be. 3 years of records." Clara stared at the notebook. "Why?" "Because somebody needed to bear witness." The Reverend's voice went soft. "My job is to see what others won't look at, to speak when others stay silent. I've been watching Mundy destroy families for 3 years, Mrs. Henshaw. Watching and documenting and praying for the right moment." "And you think this is it?" "I think Mr. Thorne rode through a blizzard to bring proof. I think he stood in that store today and forced this town to see what they've been pretending not to know. I think he's given us an opening." Amos tucked the notebook back into his coat. "But he can't do this alone. Neither can I. The town needs to hear from you." Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "Hear what?" "The truth. Your truth. What it's cost you to survive Mundy's system." The Reverend moved toward the door, then paused. "Tomorrow's Sunday. I'm planning to speak from the church, steps after service, about justice, about how the law and the gospel sometimes point different directions. I'd like you to be there." "To say what?" "Whatever you need to say, or nothing at all. Just standing there would be enough, letting this town see what their silence has cost." He opened the door and cold air rushed in. "Think about it, Mrs. Henshaw. Sometimes courage is contagious. Sometimes one voice is all it takes to start an avalanche." He left before she could answer. Clara sat by the fire long into the night, watching the flames, thinking about church steps and public witness and whether she had any courage left after 8 months of kneeling. Garrett found Tim in the stable after dark, mucking stalls by lantern light. The boy looked up when Garrett's shadow fell across the doorway. "Mr. Thorne." "Need a favor, Tim." The boy set down his shovel. "What kind?" "The kind that might get you in trouble." Garrett stepped inside and lowered his voice. "Mundy burns his trash in that ash pile out back of the store, every night, around closing." "Yes, sir. I seen him. That paper he burned today, the pricing list, I'm betting it didn't burn all the way. Paper like that, official seal, thick stock, it takes time to burn complete. Garrett met Tim's eyes. I need to know if any of it survived. Tim's face went careful. You want me to search the ash pile? Tonight, after Monday locks up and goes home. You know when that is? 9 o'clock. Always 9 o'clock. Garrett pulled a coin from his pocket, a silver dollar, more than Tim would make in a week. You find anything, even a scrap with numbers on it, you bring it to me. My camp, 5 miles north. Don't tell anyone. Not Monday, not Ida, not even the Reverend. Tim took the coin slowly. What if I get caught? Then you tell Monday you were looking for a lost horseshoe. Tell him anything but the truth. Garrett's voice went hard. But don't get caught, Tim. Men like Monday don't forget when somebody crosses them. The boy nodded once and pocketed the coin. I'll be careful. Garrett turned to leave, then stopped. Tim, why you helping? The boy's face went soft in the lantern light. Miss Clara gave me soup once when I was hungry. Didn't ask questions, didn't make me feel small, just gave me soup. He picked up the shovel again. Figure I owe her. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Garrett could see his breath in the moonlight as he walked back to his horse. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow the Reverend would speak. Tomorrow, Clara Henshaw would have to decide whether she had the strength to stand in front of her neighbors and bear witness to what Monday had done. Tomorrow the avalanche might start, or it might bury them all. Sunday morning broke gray and cold. Clara dressed Eli in his cleanest shirt and braided her hair with fingers that still ached from yesterday's scrubbing. She hadn't slept. All night she'd heard the Reverend's words. Sometimes one voice is all it takes to start an avalanche. But avalanches buried things, sometimes the people who started them. The church stood at the edge of town, white-clapboard with a small bell tower. By the time Clara and Eli arrived, families were already gathering on the steps. The Pattersons, the Callaways, old Howell and his son. Ida Kern stood near the door, her face tight with worry. Monday arrived last, his wife beside him. He wore his Sunday coat, his hair slicked back with pomade. He nodded to the Reverend as he passed, his expression pleasant. Controlled. Clara felt his eyes on her as she climbed the steps. She kept her gaze forward and her hand tight on Eli's shoulder. The service was brief, hymns, scripture, a short prayer. Then Reverend Amos stood and closed his Bible, his voice carried in the quiet church. I'm not preaching from the pulpit today. I'm speaking from the steps, where everyone can hear, where everyone can see. He walked down the aisle and out into the cold morning air. The congregation followed, confused murmurs rising. Clara's heart hammered. This was it, the moment she'd have to decide. Amos stood on the top step. The whole town gathered below. His breath came out in clouds. I want to talk about justice, about how the law and the gospel sometimes point different directions. Monday's jaw tightened. His wife touched his arm, but he shook her off. The law says a debt is a debt, Amos continued. Says a merchant can charge what he wants. Says a contract is binding, even when it's built on lies. He pulled out his notebook. But the gospel says something different. Says the truth will set you free. Says those who exploit widows and orphans will answer to God. He opened the notebook. I've been keeping records, 3 years of them. Every widow in this town, every debt, every price charged. His eyes swept the crowd. Want to hear some numbers? Silence. Then old Howell spoke up. I'd like to hear them, Reverend. Amos read slowly. Mrs. Patterson owes $42 by Monday's ledger, should owe $28 by territorial rates. Mrs. Calloway owes $55, should owe $37. Mrs. Henshaw, he looked at Clara, owes $60 by yesterday's accounting, should owe $32. The numbers fell like stones. Women's faces went pale. Men's expressions hardened. That's private business, Monday called out. You got no right. I have every right. Amos's voice cut sharp. This is God's house, and God sees ledgers different than men do. Monday stepped forward, his face red. You're turning this town against honest business, against theft. The voice came from the back. Garrett Thorne pushed through the crowd, Tim beside him. The boy held something wrapped in cloth. Garrett climbed the steps and stood beside Amos. Reverend's right about the numbers, and I got proof that didn't burn. He took the cloth from Tim and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of charred paper, half burned, edges black, but the territorial seal still visible at the top. And below it, numbers, prices, clear enough to read. Found this in Monday's ash pile last night, Garrett said, his voice carrying. Header says Montana Territory Official Pricing Standards, dated November 18th. 1878. And look here. Flour, $2.20. Medicine, 80 cents. Every item, 40% below what Mundy's been charging. The crowd pressed closer. Clara watched Mundy's face go from red to white. That could be anything, Mundy stammered. Could be old. Could be proof you've been robbing this town for years. Garrett held the burned paper up where everyone could see. Territorial seals are right here. Official signature. Date. You said you lost your pricing list in a fire. Seems like you tried to burn this one too. Didn't take. Murmurs rose. Angry now, not confused. Mrs. Patterson's husband stepped forward. You been overcharging us? All of us? Freight cost? Don't lie to us, Silas. Old Howell's voice shook. We ain't stupid. We just didn't have proof before. The crowd was shifting. Clara could feel it, the way a room changes when people stop being afraid and start being angry. She looked at Eli, his small hand gripping her skirt, and thought about 8 months of scrubbing floors, 8 months of watching her hands bleed, 8 months of choosing between medicine and food. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. He charged me $1.20 for medicine, she said. Her voice came out quiet, but people turned to listen. My son was coughing blood. I would have paid anything. He knew that. Amos touched her shoulder gently. Tell them what he made you do to work off the debt. Clara's throat went tight. Scrub his floors. 5 in the morning, 30 days. Lye soap. She held up her hands, cracked, swollen, the skin thick and damaged. These are what debt looks like when a man decides to squeeze. A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Patterson, started crying. He made me clean his windows. 3 weeks. For flour I shouldn't have owed half of. Made me mend his inventory bags, Mrs. Calloway added, her voice shaking. Told me it was that or no credit for lamp oil. The stories came faster then. Women's voices, rising in the cold air. Years of exploitation, years of silence, years of pretending they deserved what was happening to them. Mundy's face had gone gray. He looked around at his neighbors, at the faces he'd been squeezing for years, and seemed to realize he'd lost something he couldn't burn, or hide, or explain away. His power came from isolation, from making each woman think she was alone in her suffering. But standing on those church steps, with Garrett holding burned proof and Amos reading numbers and Clara showing her ruined hands, isolation shattered. They weren't alone. They'd never been alone. They'd just been scared. 3 men stepped forward from the crowd, well-dressed, clean-shaven, wearing the heavy coats of cattle buyers. Clara recognized one from the store yesterday. The tallest spoke, his voice measured. Mr. Mundy, we negotiate our cattle contracts in your store every winter, big contracts, worth more than everything else you sell combined. Mundy straightened, sensing a lifeline. Yes, and I appreciate. We're rethinking that arrangement. The cattle buyer looked at Garrett. Mr. Thorne here says there's a new trading post opening in Helena come spring, closer to the rail yard, better prices. The second buyer nodded. We'll be taking our business there, unless you can give us a reason to stay. Mundy's mouth opened, closed. His kingdom was crumbling, not from force, not from the law, but from simple economics. The buyers controlled the money, and the money was walking away. We can negotiate. Maybe you can start by forgiving Mrs. Henshaw's debt, the third buyer said. Public record, right here, right now. The church steps went silent. Every eye turned to Mundy. His jaw worked, his hands clenched. Clara felt Garrett beside her, steady as stone, felt Amos's hand still on her shoulder, felt the weight of the whole town watching. Mundy's voice came out strangled. Fine. Mrs. Henshaw's debt is forgiven. All of it, Garrett said quietly. Say it plain. All of it. Mundy's eyes were murder. Debt cleared. Public record. The Reverend wrote it in his notebook, right there on the steps. Dated, witnessed, done. Clara's knees went weak. Eli grabbed her hand, his eyes wide, but Garrett wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Mundy, his voice dropping low enough that only those nearest could hear. One more thing. Mrs. Henshaw's late husband had a saddle. You took it yesterday, for $15 credit on a debt that didn't exist. Garrett's eyes went cold. I'll be by to collect it this afternoon, and you'll return her payment. Full value. Mundy's face twisted, but he nodded once. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in conversation. Clara stood frozen on the steps, her mind spinning. Free, the debt was gone, just like that. Ida Kern pushed through and pulled her into a hug. You did it, honey. You stood up. But Clara shook her head. She hadn't done it. Garrett had. Amos had. Tim had searched an ash pile in the dark for proof that should have burned. She'd just shown her hands and told the truth. Sometimes that was enough. That afternoon, Clara sat on her porch while Eli played in the yard. The winter sun was weak, but it felt warm on her shoulders, the first real warmth she'd felt in months. She'd been free for 3 hours. 3 hours without debt. 3 hours without the weight of Monday's ledger hanging over every decision. She kept expecting it to vanish, kept waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, that she still owed, that freedom was something other people got. But no one came. The town stayed quiet, and slowly she started to believe it might be real. The sound of a wagon made her look up. Garrett Thorne pulled to a stop in front of her shack, something large wrapped in canvas in the wagon bed. He climbed down and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Henshaw." "Mr. Thorne." She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. Old habit. Her hands still ached, though the swelling had started to go down. Garrett reached into the wagon and lifted out Thomas's saddle. The leather was oiled, the buckles polished. He'd cleaned it, cared for it. He set it gently on her porch. Monday wasn't happy to part with it, Garrett said, but he parted. Clara's throat went tight. She reached out and touched the worn pommel. The stirrup Thomas had adjusted 100 times to fit his height. "Thank you. Also got this bed in." Garrett pulled out a small cloth bag and handed it to her. Coins clinked inside. $15. What Monday owed you for taking it in the first place. She stared at the bag. $15. More money than she'd seen since Thomas died. Enough to buy supplies. Enough to get through the rest of winter without scrubbing anyone's floors. "I can't." "You earned it. It's yours." Garrett's voice was firm. Monday tried to argue. I reminded him that 3 cattle buyers were watching. Clara looked up at him, really looked. The lines around his eyes, the weathered skin, the way he stood like a man who'd carried weight for too long and finally found a place to set it down. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do all this? Ride through a blizzard, stand up to Monday, risk your contracts?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. He looked past her, toward the mountains, his expression distant. "My mother was widowed when I was 6. No one helped her. She cut her hair 3 times before she couldn't anymore. Sold everything we owned piece by piece until there was nothing left but shame." His jaw tightened. "I swore, when I grew up, I'd never watch that happen again and do nothing." Clara understood then. This wasn't about her. Not really. It was about a boy who'd watched his mother destroyed by a system that ground up vulnerable people and called it business. "Your mother," she said softly. "She make it through?" "She did. Barely." Garrett's eyes came back to her. "I don't want Eli growing up watching you get destroyed. Kids shouldn't have to see that." Inside the shack, Eli coughed. Light now, not the tearing sound it had been. Just a normal child's cough. The medicine had worked. The fever was gone. He'd live. "He won't," Clara said. "Thanks to you." Garrett shook his head. "Wasn't me. Was you standing on those church steps, showing your hands, telling the truth?" He moved toward the wagon. "That's the thing people forget. Heroes don't save anyone. They just hand you the weapon you can't reach yourself. Rest is up to you." He climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Wait." Clara stepped off the porch. "Where are you going?" "Winter camp. Got cattle to tend. Contracts to finish." He tipped his hat again. "Then Helena. Got business there." "When will you be back?" Garrett's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Spring. When the mud clears and the cattle drive starts. Figured you might need work then. Cooking for a crew. Honest wages. No charity." Clara's breath caught. Work. Real work. With real pay. The kind that didn't involve kneeling or scrubbing or selling pieces of herself. "How much?" $40 a month. April through October. Food included. You and Eli both. He met her eyes. "That's standard rate for a trail cook. No favors. You earn it." $40. In 7 months, she could save enough to repair the shack, buy winter supplies, maybe even start fresh somewhere new if she wanted. "I'll think about it," she said. "You do that." Garrett flicked the reins. The wagon pulled away, wheels crunching on frozen mud. Clara watched him go until he disappeared around the bend. Then she sat on the porch beside Thomas's saddle and opened the cloth bag. The coins gleamed in the weak sunlight, silver and copper, cold and real. $15, plus the promise of 40 a month come spring, plus her debt gone, plus her son breathing easy for the first time in months. She pressed her damaged hands to her face and cried, not from grief this time, from relief, from the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying too much for too long, and finally, being allowed to set it down. Inside, Eli called for her. She wiped her face, tucked the coins into her apron pocket, and went to him. Tomorrow, she'd start planning, start figuring out what came next, start building something new from the ashes of what Monday had tried to burn. But tonight, she'd sit by the fire with her son and let herself rest. The debt was gone, winter would end, and spring would bring work and wages, and maybe, if she was careful, a future that looked like something other than survival. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. February brought the thaw. Not full spring, just a softening, a promise. Icicles dripped from eaves at midday, and the roads turned to mud. Clara heard the first robin on a Tuesday morning, its call tentative in the gray dawn. She used Monday's $15 carefully. Flour, salt, sugar, lamp oil, enough to last until the cattle drive work started. She bought fabric too, cheap calico, but clean, and sewed Eli a new shirt. His old one hung on him like a sack. The town had changed in small ways. Mrs. Patterson walked taller. Mrs. Calloway smiled at her children again. Monday's store stayed open, but the traffic had thinned. People rode to Helena when they could, or waited for the traveling merchants who came through selling goods from wagons. Monday himself had gone quiet. He still kept his ledger, still extended credit, but the prices had dropped, not to territorial standard, not quite, but closer. Close enough that people stopped whispering about riding 30 miles to shop elsewhere. Clara didn't go back to the store. Couldn't. Every time she thought about those floors, about the smell of lye soap at 5 in the morning, her stomach turned. Ida brought supplies when Clara needed them, refusing payment. "Consider it back wages for all the soup you gave Tim," she'd say, and leave before Clara could argue. The second week of March, Garrett returned. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw his wagon coming up the road, 3 other cattle buyers riding alongside. The spring contracts were starting. He stopped at her gate. "Mrs. Henshaw." "Mr. Thorne." "Still thinking about that cooking job? Or you decide against it?" Clara hung the last of Eli's shirts on the line. "I decided for it. 40 a month, you said. April through October." "That's right. When do we start?" 2 weeks. Give you time to get ready." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "This is the contract. Standard terms. You can have Reverend Amos look it over if you want. Make sure it's fair." Clara took the paper. Her hands were healing, still rough, still scarred, but functional. She could hold things again without pain shooting up her wrists. "I'll read it myself." Garrett's eyebrow rose, but he didn't argue. "Fair enough." That evening, she sat by lamplight and read every word. The contract was simple, clear, exactly what he'd promised. $40 a month, food provided, travel expenses covered. She'd cook 3 meals a day for a crew of 12 men, April 15th through October 30th. She signed it the next morning and gave it to Reverend Amos to witness. The Reverend smiled as he added his signature. "Proud of you, Clara." For what? Taking a job? For standing up, for not giving up, for showing this town that dignity matters more than debt. He folded the contract and handed it back. Thomas would be proud too. Clara's throat went tight. She nodded once and left before the tears could start. April came soft and green. The cattle drive assembled on the north edge of town. 100 head of mixed breeds, 12 drovers, 4 supply wagons. Garrett's operation was small compared to the big Texas drives, but it was organized, professional. Clara arrived with Eli on the morning of April 15th. She'd packed their belongings in 2 canvas bags. Everything they owned fit easily. Garrett met them at the lead wagon. "This is your space." He showed her a modified supply wagon with a canvas cover, a cast-iron stove bolted to a platform, storage boxes for food. "You'll ride here during the day, cook at night when we make camp. Eli can ride with you or walk with the drovers, his choice." Eli's eyes went wide. "Can I see the cows?" Garrett's mouth twitched. "Reckon you can. Come on." He led the boy toward the herd, pointing out different breeds, explaining how to read their behavior. Clara watched them go, the tall cowboy and the small boy, and something in her chest loosened. One of the drovers approached, hat in hand, young, maybe 20 so, with a sunburned face. "Ma'am, name's Charlie. Just wanted to say, we heard what happened in town. With Monday, what you did." He shifted his weight. "That took guts." Clara didn't know what to say. "I just told the truth. Most people don't, even when they should." Charlie nodded once and walked back to his horse. The drive moved out at noon. Clara sat on the wagon seat, Eli beside her, and watched the town disappear behind them. The shack she'd lived in for 8 months, the store where she'd scrubbed floors, the church steps where she'd shown her ruined hands to her neighbors, all of it falling away like old skin. The first night, she cooked beef stew over an open fire. The drovers ate in silence, then one by one they came to thank her. Good food, they said, best they'd had on a drive. Garrett ate last, sitting on a log near the fire. You're a natural at this. I've cooked before. Not for 12 hungry men after a day in the saddle. He set down his empty bowl. They're happy. That matters on a long drive. Clara poured him coffee. The night was clear, stars thick overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly. Eli was asleep in the wagon, wrapped in blankets. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. That saddle you returned. You cleaned it, oiled the leather, polished the buckles. She looked at him across the fire. That wasn't part of getting it back from Mundy. Garrett stared into his coffee. Your husband made that saddle last, took care of it. Seemed wrong to return it in the condition Mundy kept it. You didn't know Thomas. Didn't have to. A man who embroiders his wife's name on a flour sack is a man who takes care of what he loves. Garrett's eyes met hers. Figured his saddle deserved the same respect. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked hard. Thank you. You already thanked me. Not enough. They sat in silence while the fire burned low. Around them the drovers settled into their bedrolls. The night sounds of the prairie rose. Wind through grass, distant coyotes, the creak of wagons settling. Spring suits you, Mrs. Henshaw, Garrett said finally. Clara smiled. Spring suits us all, Mr. Thorne. He tipped his hat and stood. Get some rest. Long day tomorrow. She watched him walk to his own bedroll near the supply wagons. Then she banked the fire and climbed into the wagon beside Eli. The boy mumbled in his sleep and curled against her. Outside, a robin sang, the same song she'd heard that Tuesday morning in March, the sound of winter ending, the sound of things beginning again. Clara closed her eyes and let herself believe in it, in new starts, in honest work, in a future that looked like something other than debt and desperation. The cattle drive would take 6 months. By October, she'd have $240 saved, enough to start over, enough to choose. And maybe, enough to let herself trust that good men existed. Men who rode through blizzards for proof. Men who cleaned dead men's saddles because respect mattered. Men who offered work instead of charity and called it even. She fell asleep to the sound of cattle and wind and hope. October came with golden light and cool mornings. The cattle drive ended on the 30th, just as the contract specified. Garrett paid Clara in full, $240 in a leather pouch that weighed heavy in her hands. Crew says you're the best cook they've had, he told her as the drovers dispersed toward town. They're already asking if you'll sign on next year. Clara looked at the money, then at Eli. The boy had grown 3 inches over the summer. His cough was gone. His face had color. He looked like a child should look, healthy, strong, unafraid. I'll think about it. Garrett nodded. Fair enough. He hesitated, then pulled something else from his saddlebag. A flour sack, new canvas, folded neat. He handed it to her. Clara unfolded it slowly. Along the bottom hem, in careful stitching, her name. Clara Henshaw. The letters were even, precise. Different from Thomas's work, but just as deliberate. Her throat closed. You did this? Tim's mother did the stitching. I paid her. Seemed right. Garrett's voice was quiet. Figured you could use a new one. For the winter supplies you'll be buying. She ran her fingers over the embroidered letters. Thomas's sack was worn thin now, the fabric fragile from years of use. But she'd kept it. Couldn't bear to throw it away. This new one, it wasn't a replacement. It was something else. A continuation. Proof that love could leave marks in more than one hand. Thank you. The words felt too small. You earned every bit of what's in that pouch, Mrs. Henshaw. Nothing to thank me for. But there was the blizzard ride. The burned proof retrieved from ash. The stand on church steps, the respect given freely when she had nothing to offer in return. Garrett tipped his hat. See you next spring, if you're willing. He rode away before she could answer, his horse's hooves kicking up dust on the autumn road. Clara used the money carefully. She hired men to repair the shack, new chinking for the walls, a proper door that latched, glass for the windows. She bought winter supplies from the traveling merchant, not from Monday. She put away half for next year's emergencies, and she bought seeds for spring planting, vegetables for a kitchen garden, carrots, beans, squash. She hadn't had a garden since Thomas died, hadn't had the time or energy to think past the next day's survival. Now she had both. The first week of November, she planted the seeds in boxes inside the shack. They'd sprout by the window through winter, and she'd transplant them in April when the ground thawed. Eli helped, his small hands patting dirt around each seed. "Will Mr. Thorne come back?" he asked. "In the spring, for next year's drive." "Good." Eli watered the seedlings carefully. "I like him. He teaches me things." Clara smiled. "What kind of things?" "How to read cow tracks, how to tie knots, how to—" Eli trailed off, then looked up at her. "How to be good even when it's hard." Clara's hands stilled in the dirt. "He taught you that?" "He showed me. Said being good ain't about being perfect. It's about doing right even when you're scared, even when nobody's watching." Eli returned to his watering, like you did, on the church steps. Clara pulled her son close, dirt and all, and held him tight. December came, and with it the first snow. Clara hung Thomas's old flour sack on the wall above the stove, too worn to use but too precious to discard. Beside it, she hung the new one Garrett had given her, 2 pieces of fabric, 2 different hands, same message: you matter, you're seen, you're worth the careful work. On Christmas Eve, she sat by the fire with Eli and told him stories about his father, about the logging camps, about the way Thomas had laughed, about the flour sack he'd embroidered by lamplight. "Do you miss him?" Eli asked. "Every day." "Do you think he'd like Mr. Thorne?" Clara considered. Thomas had been practical, hard-working, steady. He would have respected a man who rode through blizzards for strangers, would have respected a man who returned a saddle cleaned and oiled, would have respected a man who offered work instead of pity. "I think he would." "Me too." Eli yawned and leaned against her shoulder. Outside, snow fell soft and steady. The shack was warm. The windows were whole. The cupboards were full. And on the shelf, $200 waited for emergencies that might never come. Clara looked at the flour sacks on the wall, old and new, past and future, grief and hope stitched side by side. Thomas had given her 5 years of love. Mundy had given her 8 months of hell. Garrett had given her the tools to fight back. And she'd given herself something harder, the courage to keep standing when standing seemed impossible. Spring would come, the cattle drive would start again, and she'd be there cooking for 12 men, earning honest wages, building a future one day at a time. That was enough, more than enough, that was everything. Now, some folks say Garrett Thorne saved Clara Henshaw that winter, but that ain't the whole truth. He gave her a weapon, proof that couldn't be burned, numbers that couldn't be argued. But she's the one who climbed those church steps. She's the one who held up her ruined hands and told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Mundy kept his store, but his kingdom crumbled. Turns out fear only works in the dark. Once the light gets in, once people see they're not alone in their suffering, power built on shame collapses faster than a house with rotten timber. The town learned something that spring. One witness can start an avalanche. By summer, 3 more merchants had posted their prices public, right there on the wall where anyone could see. Funny how sunlight changes behavior. Clara cooked for the cattle drives, earned every dollar. By the next winter, she had enough saved to tell any man no and mean it. That's the kind of freedom you can't buy, only build. As for Garrett, he stayed on, not out of pity, out of respect, the kind that builds slow, like green grass pushing through frozen ground. Some things can't be rushed. Some things need time and careful tending. That flour sack with her name stitched on it hung in Clara's kitchen for 20 years. Reminder that love leaves marks, kindness leaves tools. But dignity, that's something you take back yourself. Nobody can give it to you. Nobody can steal it unless you let them. Come spring, the robins returned. So did hope. And sometimes, when winter's been long and cruel, that's the whole story. Not about heroes saving anyone. About people finding the courage to save themselves and others handing them the tools they couldn't reach alone. You don't need a savior. You need a witness. Someone to stand beside you and say, I see what's happening, and it ain't right. Rest is up to your own 2 hands.